She knew about the affair for 3 years. 3 years. And she said nothing. Not because she was weak, because she had been taught from the time she was 8 years old, watching her mother press both hands flat against a kitchen table to keep herself upright, that a woman carries the unbearable quietly, and she carries it alone. 50 years of dinners made, fevers nursed, crises absorbed, tears washed away with the faucet running so no one would hear. 50 years of saying fine when she meant something else entirely. And then, on a dark evening in a yellow house on Fern Avenue, she finally stopped pretending. What she discovered about her own life was something she had never been prepared for. The morning light came through the kitchen window the same way it always had, pale and unhurried. Filtering through the yellowed cotton curtains, Dorothy May Harlan had sewn herself back in 1974. She stood at the counter with both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, watching the way the steam curled upward and disappeared before it ever reached the ceiling. It had always struck her as a quiet kind of tragedy, the way things could rise and simply vanish before anyone noticed they had ever been there at all. Dorothy, Dot, to everyone who had ever loved her, though that list had grown considerably shorter over the years, was 73 years old. She had lived in the same yellow house on Fern Avenue in East Nashville for 41 years. She had painted those walls, planted the rose bushes along the front porch, fixed the leak under the bathroom sink with her own hands when Robert refused to call a plumber. She had brought 2 babies home to that house, had cooked 10,000 meals in that kitchen, had cried into that very sink more times than she could count, always with the faucet running so no one would hear. The house was quiet now, in a way it had never been during the years she had filled it with life, a different kind of quiet, not the peaceful silence of Sunday mornings before the children woke up, but the hollow silence of rooms that had forgotten what voices sounded like. She set her mug down and walked slowly to the front door, easing it open to collect the newspaper from the porch. The November air hit her face, sharp and cold, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the block. Nashville in late autumn had always smelled like that, like burning leaves and something ending. She breathed it in and stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, her cardigan pulled tight across her chest, looking out at Fern Avenue like she was waiting for something to come walking up the street and explain itself. Nothing did, nothing ever did. She had grown up not 5 miles from where she now stood, in a 2-bedroom house near Inglewood where her mother, Frances, had raised 4 children on a schoolteacher's salary after Dot's father walked out in 1958. Dot had been 8 years old when he left. She remembered the morning clearly. A Tuesday in March, the smell of burnt toast, her mother standing very still at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface, as though she needed it to hold her upright. Her father's coffee cup was still on the counter. Her mother never spoke about that day, not once, in all the years that followed. Dot had understood something from that silence, though it would take her decades to find the words for it. She had understood that when a woman in this world was handed more pain than she could carry, she was expected to carry it quietly, to fold it up like laundry and put it somewhere no one could see, to keep moving, keep cooking, keep smiling at the neighbors on Sunday morning, to be fine, to always, relentlessly be fine. She had inherited that silence the way some women inherit their mother's eyes or their grandmother's ring. It was the most valuable and most damaging thing Frances had ever passed on to her. She had been 19 years old when she met Robert Eugene Harlan at a church social in the spring of 1969. He was 22, broad-shouldered and easy with a smile, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. He had sandy brown hair and a gap between his front teeth that she found unbearably charming. He told her that night that she had the most honest eyes he had ever seen. She had blushed and looked away and thought about those words for 3 days afterward. They were married in June of 1970. The wedding was small. Frances couldn't afford much. Held in the garden of their church on a Saturday afternoon that was already thick with Tennessee heat before noon. Dot wore her mother's altered dress and carried white gardenias, and she remembered standing at the end of that garden aisle, looking at Robert's face and feeling something she could only describe as the terrifying sweetness of being completely certain. She was certain. She had never been more certain of anything in her life. She should have learned then that certainty was not a promise, that the feeling of being sure was not the same as being safe. But she was 19, and the gardenias smelled beautiful, and Robert was smiling at her with that gap-toothed grin, and she walked toward him in her mother's dress thinking that this was the beginning of everything good. She had no way of knowing, standing in that garden in the Nashville heat, that she was also walking toward the longest and most quietly devastating education of her life, that the man with the honest smile would teach her things about loss and betrayal she had never imagined learning, that the children she would bring into the world and love with everything she had would one day look straight through her as though she were made of glass. She had no way of knowing that the wound had already begun, quiet as a crack in a foundation, invisible until the whole structure shifted. She went back inside. The newspaper could wait. She sat back down at the kitchen table with her cooling coffee, and outside Nashville went on as it always did, indifferent and beautiful and full of people moving through their own invisible griefs. Robert Harlan was not a cruel man. That was the thing Dot had turned over in her mind 10,000 times across 50 years, like a stone she kept expecting to find something different underneath. He was not cruel. He did not raise his hand to her. He did not call her names or chase her from the house. He was, by the measures most people used, a decent man. He went to work, he mowed the lawn on Saturdays. He remembered birthdays well enough. But there are ways of hurting someone that leave no marks that anyone else can see. And Robert Harlan had mastered nearly all of them. It began subtly, the way most slow erosions do. The first year of marriage was hard in the ordinary way. Two young people learning each other's edges, negotiating space and money and habit. Dot worked as a bookkeeper at a printing company on Charlotte Avenue. Robert worked for his uncle's construction business. They were scraping by, which she had expected, and she had been genuinely happy in the scraping, cooking big pots of soup on Sunday nights, making their small apartment on Elliston Place feel like something, learning each other. But she noticed early on that when she spoke about things that mattered to her, her thoughts about a book she'd read, a worry that kept her awake, something she hoped for, Robert had a way of nodding and then redirecting the conversation back to himself. Not aggressively, just consistently, as if her inner life was a foreign channel he had accidentally tuned into and politely tolerated before switching back. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was being too sensitive. Their daughter Linda was born in 1972. Their son James arrived in 1975. Those were the two best days of Dorothy Harlan's life without qualification or caveat. She had looked at each of those newborn faces and felt something so large and so fierce move through her that it frightened her. A love that had no floor, no ceiling, no walls. She would have walked barefoot across broken glass for either of them without a moment's hesitation. Motherhood became the architecture of her existence. She poured herself into it completely, enthusiastically, the way she poured herself into everything she truly believed in. She nursed them through fevers, read to them every night, attended every school play and little league game and parent-teacher conference. She learned to stretch a grocery budget like taffy, making sure the children had what they needed even when there wasn't much to go around. Robert left the child rearing mostly to her. He was not unkind to the children, but he was absent in the way that men of his generation often were. Present in the house, but somehow not quite in the room. Dot had accepted this division without debate because she had never seen anything different growing up, and because she genuinely loved caring for Linda and James and had not yet learned to ask whether it was equitable. What she had not yet fully seen was what was developing in the gaps of Robert's unexplained absences. He traveled often for the construction business, or said he did. He worked late, or said he did. He was tired, distracted, unreachable in the evenings in ways she couldn't quite name. It was Ruth Delaney, her neighbor 3 houses down, a sharp-eyed woman from Clarksville who had seen most things twice, who finally told her. Ruth came to her back door on a Wednesday afternoon in October of 1981 while the children were at school and sat down across from Dot at the kitchen table with an expression that said she had been carrying something heavy for too long. "I don't want to be the one to tell you this," Ruth said, "but I'd want someone to tell me." The woman's name was Sandra. She worked at a bank downtown. It had been going on, by Ruth's estimation, for at least 2 years. Dot sat very still while Ruth talked. She heard the words. She processed them one by one, carefully, the way you step across ice when you don't know how thick it is. When Ruth finished, Dot thanked her, offered her more coffee, and waited until Ruth had gone home before she went to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and let herself fall apart against the tile wall. She cried for 40 minutes. Then she washed her face, reapplied her lipstick, and went to pick up the children from school. She never told Robert she knew. She carried that knowledge inside her like a stone in her chest for 3 full years, convincing herself each morning that she was staying for Linda and James, that disrupting their lives would be selfish, that perhaps it would end on its own, that she could bear it, that she was strong enough. She was, after all, her mother's daughter. The affair with Sandra did end. She learned this years later from a slip of Robert's that he never realized he'd made. But Robert, unburdened of that particular secret, simply found new ways of disappearing. He drank more than he should. He spent money they didn't have on things that never appeared in their house. He came home some nights with an energy that felt wrong, bristling and defensive, and when Dot asked carefully, never confrontationally, always carefully, he would look at her with a kind of flat contempt, as if her concern were an inconvenience he had not ordered. "You always make everything into something," he would say. And because she had been told this enough times, in enough tones, she began to believe it. Her mother, Frances, developed rheumatoid arthritis in 1983 and could no longer care for herself properly. Without discussions, simply the thing to be done, Dot took over. She drove to her mother's house 3 times a week, managed her medications, cleaned and shopped, and sat with her through the bad days. Frances was not an easy woman to care for. She had spent so long being self-reliant that receiving help felt like an indignity, and she communicated this through a low-grade sourness that Dot absorbed without complaint. Robert never drove Frances to a single appointment. He never offered, and Dot never asked. She had stopped asking for things by then. Her sister Carol lived in Memphis and called twice a month. Her brothers were occupied with their own lives. The weight of Frances's care fell entirely on Dot's shoulders, as everyone silently agreed it should, because Dot was the one who had always managed things, who had never complained, who was strong. They had confused her silence for strength. They had no idea what it had cost her. The years between 1985 and 1995 were the decade Dot thought of as the decade of invisible labor. She was working full-time by then, having taken a position as office manager at a medical practice on West End Avenue, a job she was quietly excellent at, organized and calm and attentive to detail. She came home from 8 hours of managing other people's problems to manage her own: dinner on the table, homework supervised, laundry folded, Frances called, bills reviewed. The small engine of the household kept running by the force of her relentless, unacknowledged effort. Linda was a teenager by then, which brought its own particular weather system into the house. At 15, she was brilliant and mercurial and furious at everything without being able to articulate why, which Dot recognized as the particular fury of a girl becoming a woman in a world that wasn't ready for her. She tried to be patient with Linda, tried to give her room without giving her too much rope, tried to listen without managing. Some days it worked, many days it didn't. James was quieter, a sweet, somewhat passive boy who followed his father's lead in most things, which meant following his father's example of benign detachment from the domestic machinery his mother kept running. James was not unkind to her. He simply didn't see her, not really. He saw her the way you see the furniture in a room you've lived in too long, present, essential to the room's function, but invisible by familiarity. Robert's drinking became impossible to ignore around 1988. He never became violent. She would hold on to that detail for years as evidence that things were not as bad as they were. He became instead something harder to name: sullen, contemptuous, given to long silences that filled rooms like weather. He criticized her cooking and then ate every bite. He dismissed her opinions in front of the children with a small, dismissive sound that she felt each time like a hand pressed against her sternum. He made her feel, by degrees and accumulation, like a piece of furniture he was tired of looking at. She thought about leaving more than she ever admitted, even to Ruth. She had run the numbers in her head late at night while Robert slept: what she earned, what the children needed, where they would go. She could have made it work. She had always been good at making things work. But leaving felt like an admission of failure, and she had been raised in a world that counted a woman's failed marriage as her personal failing. She had been raised to endure. So she endured. Frances died in the spring of 1991. Dot had been there. She was always there, sitting beside her mother's bed in the small room at Vanderbilt Medical Center when Frances closed her eyes for the last time. She held her mother's hand, which had grown thin and papery with age, and she felt the complicated grief of losing someone you loved deeply and had also spent years quietly resenting. Resenting not as a person, but as a mirror. Frances had shown her how to be invisible and had never meant to, and now she was gone. And Dot was crying at the bedside for reasons she couldn't fully sort out. The family gathered for the funeral. Her brothers came, her sister came, there were casseroles and cards and the rituals of grief performed correctly. And then everyone went back to their lives, and Dot was left with the task of settling Frances's small estate, managing the accounts, dealing with the landlord, sorting through 60 years of accumulated possessions. She did it alone. Robert offered to help twice, in a tone that communicated he hoped she would say it wasn't necessary. She said it wasn't necessary. She packed her mother's entire life into boxes by herself over 3 weekends, crying in the empty apartment when the light was right and she could be sure no one would see. The year Linda graduated high school and left for the University of Tennessee in Knoxville was the year that Robert told her, on a Tuesday evening in June, with almost no preface, that he had been seeing someone, a different someone, not Sandra, someone new. "I think we've been over for a long time." He said it the way you'd say that a car needs new tires. Practical, inevitable. Dot looked at him across the kitchen table. Her kitchen table, in the house she had run and repaired and maintained for 20 years, and she felt something in her go very, very quiet. Not the silence of acceptance, the silence of a person who has just understood something they had known for a long time, but had refused to let themselves know. "All right," she said. The divorce was finalized into an apartment of 1994. He eventually married the new woman. Her name was Diane, and she was 41, 10 years younger than Dot. Dot heard this from James, who told her with the careful tone of someone expecting an explosion that never came. She thanked him for telling her. She went to the bathroom and turned on the faucet. She did not fall apart this time. She stood at the sink and looked at her own face in the mirror for a long moment, and what she saw there frightened her in a new way. She looked tired, not sleepy tired, soul tired, the kind of tired that sleep does not touch. She was 44 years old. She had given 24 years to a marriage that had taken everything she offered and handed her invisibility in return. She had 2 children who needed her. She had a job she was good at. She had Ruth, who came over that Friday night with a bottle of wine and sat with her until midnight saying all the right things. She had survived. She told herself that was enough. But the crack she had felt on her wedding day, the one she hadn't known to name, had grown in 24 years into something structural, something that ran through every room of who she was. You could paper over it. You could learn to walk around it. But it was there. It had always been there. And now she could not pretend otherwise. The decade that followed the divorce was, in some ways, the most functional period of Dot's life. She was on her own for the first time, truly on her own, and she found that she was better at it than she had expected. She renegotiated her salary at the medical practice and got what she asked for. She learned to enjoy her own company, at least in small doses. She read more. She joined a garden Yellow House herself over 2 weekends in August, up on a ladder in the heat, sweating through her shirt, and felt something close to pride when she climbed down and looked at what she had done. Linda, who had graduated from UT and moved to Atlanta to work in marketing, called every week without fail throughout her 20s. They had developed, away from the friction of Robert's household, a genuine friendship. 2 women who talked honestly and laughed together and argued sometimes but always came back to each other. Linda was decisive and a little impatient and very smart, and Dot was proud of her in a way that was almost painful. James had stayed closer to Nashville, working in sales and eventually marrying a woman named Carrie from Murfreesboro. They had 2 children, Tyler and Avery, and for a while the grandchildren were the great, uncomplicated joy of Dot's life. She babysat every week, attended every birthday party, baked the cakes, wrapped the presents. She was present in the way she had always been present, completely, warmly, without being asked twice. It was in her late 50s that she began to notice the shift. It happened so gradually that she could not have named the moment it began. Linda's weekly calls became bi-weekly, then monthly. The conversations, when they came, had a new quality, efficient, warm enough on the surface, but with an undercurrent of management, as though Dot were something on a checklist. "Are you okay? How's the house? Staying busy?" "Good, good. Listen, I have to run." James and Carrie moved to a new neighborhood in Franklin, bigger house, better school district, and suddenly the weekly babysitting arrangements became complicated. Carrie had her own mother nearby, who was more available, more convenient. The calls from James grew shorter. His visits, which had always been frequent, became occasional. She heard from Tyler and Avery through James secondhand, as though she were someone they had grown up knowing but had gradually outgrown. She tried not to read anything into it. She told herself that children grow up, build their own lives, that she should not expect to be central to the lives of her adult children. She had read articles about this, the psychological literature of the empty nest, and she intellectually understood all of it. But understanding something with your mind does not stop it from arriving at your heart like a fist. The Christmas of 2015 was the first holiday in 40 years she spent without either of her children. Linda was in Europe with friends, a trip she had planned for months and mentioned to Dot twice, briefly. James and Carrie were spending the holiday with Carrie's parents in Gatlinburg. Dot found out about both of these plans not through direct conversation, but through the accumulation of excuses that arrived over several weeks. She had Ruth for Christmas dinner. Ruth, at 71, was having her own battles with a hip that needed replacing, but she came anyway. And they ate Dot's roast chicken and drank 2 glasses of wine each and watched an old movie on television. And it was fine. It was actually fine, in the way that you can be fine right up until the moment you're not. She had gone to bed that night and lain in the dark of the yellow house, in the room she had shared with Robert for 24 years and slept in alone for 20 more. And she had thought, I gave them everything, not as an accusation, not even as a complaint, just as a fact. I gave them everything I had, everything I knew how to give. I showed up every time. I never asked them to see how much it cost me because I didn't want to burden them. And maybe that was the mistake, she thought. Maybe the silence had cost her more than she knew. Robert died in February of 2018. He was 69, a heart attack, quick, at home. Diane called to tell her, which Dot thought was strange and also somehow appropriate, a call across 48 years of shared history from a woman she had never met. She thanked Diane and said she was sorry for her loss, and when she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table with her hands in her lap and tried to locate what she felt. Grief was there, complicated and unresolved. Not grief for the man he had been in recent years, but grief for the man she had believed he was in the garden in 1970, the man with the gap-toothed smile who said she had the most honest eyes he had ever seen. She grieved that man, that moment, that version of herself who had been so certain. She went to the funeral because Linda asked her to. They stood together in the receiving line, Dot and her daughter, Robert's ex-wife and daughter, and Dot shook hands with Robert's relatives and accepted their condolences with composure. She caught her reflection in the glass of a framed photograph in the funeral home lobby and barely recognized the woman looking back at her, white-haired, 70 years old, still standing straight. Outside afterward, Linda had hugged her and said, "You okay, Mom?" "I'm fine," Dot had said. Linda had accepted that immediately, had not pushed, had not asked twice. Of course she hadn't. That was what Dot had taught her. That was the inheritance she had passed on. The silence, the "I'm fine," the refusal to burden anyone with the actual weight of what she felt. She had taught her children the same thing her mother had taught her, without ever meaning to. And now they applied the lesson back to her with perfect, devastating efficiency. The year that finally cracked something open in Dorothy Harlan was 2019, the year she turned 69. James called in March to say that he and Carrie were moving to Phoenix. He said it with the tone of a man reporting a work decision that had already been made. Not cruel, not apologetic, simply factual. Tyler was in high school by then. Avery was in middle school. They were moving in June. She listened. She asked questions about the house they had found, about James's job opportunity, about the kids' reaction. She said it sounded like a wonderful opportunity. She said she was happy for them. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for so long that the light outside changed, afternoon to evening to dark, without her moving. She sat in the dark kitchen and she thought about all of it. The whole accumulated weight of 50 years of giving and being unacknowledged. The marriage she had stayed in too long. The mother she had buried alone. The children she had made herself invisible for. The holidays she had spent swallowing her own loneliness like medicine. The wound was not new. She understood that now. The wound had been there for 50 years. She had simply, finally, run out of ways to pretend it wasn't. She put her head down on the kitchen table and cried, without the faucet running, without anyone to hear, and let herself finally feel the full, undeniable weight of it. Ruth Delaney's hip replacement went badly. She was in rehabilitation at a facility near Belmont for 6 weeks in the spring of 2020, and Dot drove there every other day without being asked, bringing Ruth's particular brand of Earl Grey tea and a rotating selection of library books, and the specific brand of shortbread cookies Ruth had liked since 1987. "You don't have to keep coming," Ruth said one afternoon in April. "I know," Dot said, and opened the next book. Ruth knew her better than anyone living. Ruth had watched her walk through 40 years of her life and had loved her through all of it without asking her to be different. That was not a small thing. Dot had come in recent years to understand how rare that was. It was Ruth who finally said, sitting across from Dot in the garden of the rehabilitation facility on a warm afternoon in May, with the azaleas in full bloom and 2 cups of tea going cold between them, "Have you ever told your children what your life actually cost you?" Dot looked at the azaleas for a long moment. "No," she said. "Why not?" She thought about her mother standing at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface, holding herself up. She thought about the faucet she had turned on 100 times so no one could hear. She thought about the word fine and all the years it had covered like paint over a crack. "Because I was taught that you don't," she said. "Because I thought if I was quiet enough about the hard parts, they would just be less hard." "And were they?" Ruth asked. "No," Dot said. "They just happened without witnesses." She called Linda that evening, from the kitchen of the yellow house, standing at the counter where she had stood for 40 years. Linda answered on the 3rd ring, distracted sounding. "Mom, everything okay?" "I need to tell you something," Dot said. "And I need you to listen, not
There was
just
a pause
hear
on
me,
the other end.
actually
A shift in the
listen."
quality of the silence.
"Okay," Linda said. Her voice had changed, slower, present. Dot talked for 45 minutes. She did not perform it, did not make it a speech. She told the truth carefully and plainly, the way she had always wished she could. She told Linda about the affair she had known about and carried alone for 3 years. She told her about the Christmas of 2015 and what it had felt like to sit in that house with no one. She told her about James's call from Phoenix and the long dark evening she had spent at the table afterward. She told her about the way being invisible had not been a dramatic event, but a slow accumulation. 1,000 small moments when she had swallowed what she felt because she didn't want to be a burden. She told her about her mother, about the kitchen table, about the inheritance of silence. Linda was quiet through most of it. At one point Dot could hear that she was crying, and she stopped and said, "I'm not trying to make you feel guilty." "I know," Linda said thickly. "I'm trying to finally be seen," Dot said. "I'm 73 years old and I'm tired of being invisible, even to you, even to myself." Linda flew in from Atlanta the following weekend. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon with overnight bags and a box of Dot's favorite pastries from a Nashville bakery she had looked up specifically, and when Dot opened the front door and saw her daughter standing on the porch of the yellow house, she felt something shift, not dramatically, not like a revelation in a movie, but quietly, like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for too long. They sat at the kitchen table for most of that Saturday evening. Linda asked questions she had never asked before. Real questions about Dot's life before the marriage, about what she had wanted, about what she was proud of, about what she still wanted. Dot answered honestly, sometimes stumblingly, sometimes with more feeling than she had planned. "I want to start a garden," Dot said at one point. "A real one. Not just the roses, vegetables. I've been thinking about it for years and I keep not doing it." "Then do it," Linda
I
said.
might
also want to take a trip. I've never been to Maine. I've always wanted to see Maine." "Then we're going to Maine," Linda said without hesitation. James called the following Tuesday. He had talked to Linda. His voice on the phone had a quality she had not heard in years, uncertain, humbled, present. He said he was sorry. He said it plainly, without excuses, and she listened and accepted it the way you accept something you have needed for a long time. She did not tell either of them that the apologies, while welcome, did not erase the years. She did not need to perform the completeness of her forgiveness for their comfort. She was 73 years old, and she had finally, given herself permission to hold the whole truth of her life without minimizing it. The damage was real. The wounds were real. They had been accumulated across 50 years of silence and sacrifice and invisible labor and grief carried alone, and they did not dissolve because the people who had contributed to them said sorry, however sincerely. The wounds were part of her. They had shaped her. They had cost her things she could not get back. But she was also still here, and that was something she had not always known how to value. Spring came to Nashville the way it always did, suddenly, generously, the red buds bursting into color along Fern Avenue before anyone was quite ready for them. Dot ordered seeds from a catalog: tomatoes, green beans, zucchini, basil. She drove to a garden center on Gallatin Pike and came home with bags of soil and a set of new trowels. She worked in the backyard on a Saturday morning in April, on her knees in the dirt, in the same good light that came through the yellow house's windows, and she planted each seed with the deliberateness of someone who had decided to take up space. Ruth came over that afternoon, managing well enough on her replaced hip, and sat in the garden chair Dot had set out, supervising with opinions about spacing and drainage that Dot mostly ignored. They argued companionably about tomato varieties until the sun dropped low and long and orange across the backyard. "You look different," Ruth said, as Dot brushed the dirt from her knees and straightened up. "I feel different," Dot said. It was not the whole truth, because the whole truth was more complicated. She still woke sometimes at 3 in the morning with the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. She still had days when the loneliness was very loud and the yellow house felt very large. She still felt, now and then, the particular grief of having given so much of her one life to people who had not known what it cost. But she had also stopped running the faucet. She had stopped folding her pain like laundry and hiding it somewhere no one could see. She had stopped saying fine when she meant something else entirely. She was 73 years old, and she had planted tomatoes, and she was going to Maine in October with her daughter, and she was going to take up exactly as much space as she required. The wound was still there. It would always be there. Her life was living proof of that. Pain at the depth she had known does not simply resolve. It becomes part of your architecture the way a scar becomes part of skin. You don't stop feeling it. You learn, if you are lucky and stubborn and finally honest enough, to live alongside it without letting it write the whole story. She looked at the turned earth where the seeds were, all the underground waiting, all the potential that had not yet shown itself. She thought of her mother at the kitchen table, hands flat, holding herself up. She thought of the garden in 1970 and the gardenias and the certainty she had felt. She did not regret that certainty. She had learned slowly and at great cost that love is not foolish because it sometimes fails to survive, that giving is not weakness because it sometimes goes unacknowledged, that the life she had built, imperfect, scarred, costly, was still hers, still real, still worth the morning light coming through the yellow curtains that she had sewn herself in 1974, still worth the standing up. Inside the yellow house, the kitchen table waited. The curtains moved in a small outside on
draft.
Fern Avenue. Nashville went about its afternoon, unhurried, ongoing, indifferent to one woman's quiet revolution, while in the backyard, in the April dirt, in the dark below the surface, something she had planted was already beginning, invisibly, to grow.